Hello and welcome to another episode of the Revenue Revolution podcast sponsored by Jointflows. Today we're joined by David Connors, who is the CEO and co-founder of The Swarm. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you here. We always typically start in the same format, which is to get a little bit of a brief history of who David Connors is, what you've been up to, how you've got to where you are today.
Sure. So I'm from Australia originally. That's the accent.
Yeah,
But I've been living in the Bay Area for about 10 years. And before this was actually in London for a few years, straight out of university, doing my
nice.
stint as a management consultant, and then hung up the suit and tie, moved to Silicon Valley. Didn't have a job, had about 10 weeks to find a job before the government kicked me out. So found a small health tech startup that sponsored my visa and just, got into it, got into all the different circles and meetups and met more and more founders and just loved the whole startup ecosystem. So eventually sort of started doing a side hustle of like setting up outbound growth funnels for these founders coming out of 500 and YC, and just sort of word of mouth, sort of started spreading around, started helping other folks. And then I was like, all right, there's a business in this. So I quit my full-time job, started the one-man consulting shop. It was called Automately. We're sort of automating these, outbound funnels. And then
Yeah.
from there, actually, this sort of evolution to the founders being like, you know what, our biggest problem is actually just hiring engineers to build the product to then be able to sell. Can we use some of these growth tools and tactics on the recruiting side? So I was like, all right, let's try it. Let's run the experiment. If that's your biggest pain point.
Yeah.
That then evolved into this outbound candidate sourcing, so tech-enabled service, and that ended up getting acquired by Sequoia Capital. That was an interesting story. Happy to sort of go into that, but I was then in-house at Sequoia as a founder in
Mm.
residence, building them other custom tools. Built about 12 different tools with a great team when I was there, including the data science team and the in-house product team. And then hit the end of my vest, shook off the golden handcuffs, and kind of wanted to get back to being a founder again. So had a lot I wanted to put into practice, and that's where the Swarm then first started. So late 21, left Sequoia, started the Swarm, and been building that ever since.
Wow, what story. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Let's talk about the Swarm a little bit. How talk to us about that. What are you guys up to over there?
Yeah, so the Swarm is helping companies to map and leverage the collective network that sits around their company. So obviously,
Mm.
we all know LinkedIn. LinkedIn's great for an individual's network, but it does a pretty poor job of leveraging the collective network of a company. And there's just a lot of noise. There's a lot of, and actually, I connected with thousands of people. I don't know 90% of them. It's not a
Mm.
real accurate representation of your relationships. And what we're finding is companies more and more these days want to have a relationship database that they can actually rely on, that has fresh data that can be plugged into the other systems that they're already using. LinkedIn doesn't really play nicely with their data and doesn't plug into anything else. And then is able to sort of grow the company in a more efficient way, right? So rather than relying on this growth at all costs kind of model, we're helping companies to build in a way more efficient way. So mainly for sales and being able to acquire and close customers. But there's other use cases. So VCs and investors use it. We also have some recruiting teams and founders use it for fundraising as well.
Yeah, it's
Nice.
really good. I've been on the platform for a few days, and there's an additional layer of like connectivity and signal strength, which I think is really powerful because, as you said, I've got, I don't know, maybe 5,000 connections, and half of that are recruiters. But
Yeah.
then, so being able to just filter out who I actually have a connection with, where someone can come and then ask for help from them is really useful. Hey, David, I think we're speaking a lot about outbound, inbound, and there's more and more of a talk about nearbound, which essentially is a little bit where you guys sit. How do you
Right.
see this evolution of, okay, well, it's not completely inbound, it's not completely outbound, it's very much within your network, or like first degree, second degree networks? Where is this coming from?
Yeah, I think it's evolving as buyers evolve how they go through the buying journey, right? So it's becoming a lot more like consumers, where they'll do a lot of their own research before talking to a salesperson. I think 80-90% of a buyer's journey is done before they even talk to a company. So where are they getting that data and that information? Similar to when you go and buy a, I don't know, bike or a computer, you ask your friends and the people you trust, right? So you're kind of asking your peers. And to date, that's just been very ad hoc. You know, we don't really know who these people are being influenced by, but what we know is actually there's relationships that exist that each person has and that a collective, company has, that are going to be influencing that buyer. And we can actually build more of a systematic approach towards not only getting intros, to the right buyer at the right time, but actually to warm up and nurture that that's a potential buyer. So when they reach the 3 to 5% of the market who's finally in that actively looking for a solution, they're going to have a lot of education and awareness of your product or service, and they're going to trust you a little bit more than anything else because they've already been exposed to you and hearing about you. So it's this sort of whole, new playbook really of how you go about marketing as well as selling.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said something really interesting there, which is, almost keeping these leads nurtured until they're actually actively in the market. I mean, that's when the actual true sales cycle begins, you could argue. Talk a little bit about the tactics that you've seen deployed in that nurturing phase. What does that look like? What do you see working well? Also, what do you see not working so well?
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on the product, right? For us, we're a B2B SaaS. We're actually selling to other sales and go-to-market teams. So a lot of our audience is on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny because, my inbox is like flooded with people trying to sell me stuff. It's like cold, undifferentiated, kind of emails. And I'll often try and respond to a lot of them and be like, hey man, like stop doing this playbook and try use the swarm instead, because you're gonna have a lot more, It's great for me. But what I try and do is, I think I follow the playbook of Adam Robinson, retention. If you've seen any of Max Greenwald and the Warmly guys, like I think they're doing some great stuff, which is building trust at scale with founder-led content. And I think the tip of the spear, especially for early stage companies without a big brand, is often should be the founder who has, the vision and the story to tell. And execs and buyers want to connect with a human, right? They don't want to connect with the swarm necessarily. They want to connect with David, and like they want to talk to me about it. And it's much more interesting than getting a newsletter from a brand, right? So I think this actually scales up really well. Like obviously there's lots of other things you can do to start building the brand, but it's pretty crazy when you start seeing like just LinkedIn, but it's just across Twitter and other social platforms as well, having the follow count be way higher for an individual than the actual company itself.
Yeah. Do you, sorry, Mick, getting a bit excited here, so I've jumped to my position. You mentioned Twitter, for example, as well. Obviously, within the professional landscape, we see LinkedIn being used a lot in terms of building that personal brand, and I agree that it's becoming more and more important to have it. In fact, Mick's made it a real focal point of his to try to get me to post a little bit more regularly on LinkedIn, which I've started to do, thankfully. What other platforms do you see being used successfully as part of that ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there's only so much you can do with the online platforms as well. This is an important thing where, all right, so we've got social, we've got, email obviously as well, and we've got, some other communities, Slack communities, different groups people part of. But you've also got to pair that with the offline, because I think, again, we're getting back to building authentic relationships, and you can build a very efficient number or a large number of relationships online, but the power of that offline event, conference, meetup, whatever it is, having that kind of in-person time. It doesn't have to be every week, but every quarter, a few times a year, having those touch points in person with your customers, with your prospective buyers, is going to be super valuable. And I think people are starting to kind of appreciate maybe the ROI of conferences a little bit more when they're done right. Obviously, it can be a huge waste of money if you do it wrong. But sort of pairing all this together in, which is sort of forming the foundation of the playbook of 2030, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, what is it? The predictable revenue playbook, I think is called the typical email sequencing cadencing. Like, do you still feel there's a place for it in today's, like, we are speaking about SaaS here, but overall sales outbound approach?
Yeah, look, I think the predictable revenue playbook, 10 to 15 years, obviously Salesforce was the one who first kind of pioneered it, and then it spread to 100,000 VC-backed startups. And the kind of idea of hiring a bunch of SDRs straight out of college to spray and pray and try and create demand, I think that model is dying or gone. I think what is still relevant is definitely hyper-targeted outbound. And I think the work of Brendan Short, for example, and some of the other great players like Common Room and some other signal-based selling sort of evangelists, I think are on the right track, where you're sort of combining a mix of first-party and third-party signals to reach out to prospective buyers at the right time with the right channel, and with the right person, and be able to have a really relevant conversation, whether it's that they've visited your website and that they've engaged with something in your product, that you've, got all these interesting signals that are kind of forming this picture that then means it's the right time. That I think can still work really well. Now, obviously, this is also going to become commoditized over time and is then going to become the norm. So then kind of what happens after that? And, I think that's where we're sort of playing, which is the human relationships will always cut through the signal, because especially for high ACV deals, there has to be trust that exists between the seller and the buyer, and this accountability in particular. And for anyone that's selling 6-figure, even 5-figure deals, you want to have a human on the other side of the table that's accountable. I don't want to be trusting some AI bot that is going to fudge the deal. So look, I think, there's 1,000 micro activities that happen in the sales funnel, right? And I think as you get down to the bottom, that's going to be all humans. But towards the top, doing that research, ingesting these signals, building a picture with huge amounts of data, I think that's jobs that AI and robots do really well, and then it kind of gets handed to the humans who can then kind of take the ball and run with it.
Yeah. You mentioned Adam Robinson. I'm a big fan of Adam. Like, I've been sharing his post everywhere, especially on in our internal chatters. So it's a little bit like a Conor McGregor, like UFC pre-fight face-off. I love it because it's like, man, the guy is not scared. Like,
picking fights with 6 cents.
and then making it public. How many? I mean, it's unique to him, I think, because he's got. I can't say the word.
He's got a big following as well.
Yeah, he's got.
Yeah.
He can do it, right? And but what's the in between where that you're not Adam Robinson, but you'd like to get a little bit of momentum on LinkedIn? How do you build that brand without going to war?
Yeah. I think it's also it's so true as well that, like, this seems, when you see some of the stuff that Adam Robinson is putting out, it's polished, it feels like he's got a whole team, of like people writing for him, which he probably does, I'm sure he's got like a bunch of people helping him produce all that stuff. But as an individual contributor, sales rep, if I'm an SDR and an AE, and I'm thinking, how do I kind of start building trust at scale? What should I be posting about? What I talk to sales folks about is, starting where you are and kind of talking to your audience to begin with, and where do you have any credibility and authority to be talking, which is doing your own role, obviously, and kind of sharing what you're learning in that role. And then just getting started. It doesn't matter that it's not super polished. I think just sort of start getting into the habit and building the muscle. And it doesn't always have to be, on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. Like, you can just be sending out a short newsletter, or you can be just commenting as well. I think it's a really great way just to sort of get into the habit. It doesn't have to be necessarily a post every day, just like commenting on other people's stuff. And often you'll find like a comment thread get started where that will be an interesting topic that you can then turn into a post, I think that's where I see a lot of people get stuck, as they sort of sit with like a blank page and they're like, geez, what should I post about today? It's actually just like get out there, try and get out into the community, into the world, just like what are people talking about? And yeah, then kind of creating content kind of around that that's interesting and hopefully is educating your buyers as well, ideally.
Yeah. Do you think people should be building a personal brand around thought leadership or their product, or a combination of both?
I think it's, again, like this comes back to this kind of building trust with other humans. And that's hard to do when you're just sort of pitching your product the whole time. Like kind of pitching, not really pitching, but just sort of like, sharing about yourself, humanizing like your own experience, obviously trying to be like, I don't really want to say vulnerable, but that kind of stuff is like being a little bit vulnerable and just opening up a little bit more and not just acting like everything's perfect. Like I did a podcast recently where I was sort of talking about how when I went to go get a grad job after university, like I interviewed with like 100 firms and didn't get anything, right? And that was because during university I prioritized traveling and spent all my time and money doing that, not doing internships. That was a decision I made. But when it came down to then getting a grad job, I didn't have as much experience and I got looked over. But that led me on the path that I am today, and I ended up moving to London and very happy for it. But just things like that, I think people can just open up and just sort of try and share a little bit more, and you'll be so surprised at how that kind of comes back and the value of then sort of building those more authentic kind of real connections with people. And then, as much as you can, like just sharing what you're learning from your buyers and, in the community and the industry as well. It doesn't all have to be about pitching and pushing your product. It can just be like, hey, talk to 10 execs this week. Here's what I've learned, things like that.
Yeah. I like it. I think it's a huge, like, I think we should go on Twitter because I see
it's called X. It's called X, mate.
Yeah, on X.
That's right.
We should go on MySpace and try and get business. But like it's another channel, I think, which is extremely populated. There's a lot of people there, and I don't think because it's not strictly professional. I think you can get away with a lot more. And like I just don't know how to do it. Like I've just learned LinkedIn, and I've learned, like to your point, David, I learned how not to get stuck in front of the blank page, because like when I first started posting, it took, I don't know, it would take 2 hours to write a post. Now I take 6 ChatGPT prompts and then I'm there, like,
Nice. I don't know. I'm not a Twitter expert. Like I have barely any Twitter, kind of following. But one of my best friends is like, that's his whole thing. He's basically created a whole business around Twitter and monetizing that. And figuring out how that whole game works. I'd say it's probably better to like pick one and like kind of focus and like double down on it. I mean, again, like not to reference Adam Robinson too much, but I think he actually mentioned that like he sees LinkedIn sort of like building in a much faster kind of way, and it's actually like easier to build a following on LinkedIn at the moment, just the way that they're kind of building the algorithms and sort of really trying to prioritize this thought leadership type content from individuals, and like deprioritizing from brands. And Twitter is just, as you say, it's very noisy and it's very difficult to kind of crack through if you weren't there from the start and don't have like a huge following already. But maybe, try air chat or like, some of the new ones that are popping up, or jump into some of these more Slack communities or smaller WhatsApp groups as well.
I had another one to chuck in the mix. I'm a big fan of Gary Vaynerchuk, Gary V. If you're familiar with him. A few months ago, he was talking about Facebook Reels and how businesses are underutilizing there because there's a lot of eyeballs over there, but the content isn't necessarily business focused. And because the eyeballs are there, if you get in front there first, you almost get a little bit of first movers advantage there as well.
I'm sure for any B2C stuff, like that's totally like TikTok, and Facebook Reels, I think. I'm not sure for B2B. I guess some companies that would make sense as well, maybe for lower ACV or different other types of buyers that are on those platforms. But it's just run the experiments, right? Like I think Jim Collins sort of, analogy of like, if you've got a certain amount of gunpowder, you don't want to fire like 2 cannonballs and like run out of gunpowder. You want to fire a bunch of bullets, right? Little small experiments, and then gather the data from all those, and then you launch your big cannonball. Like that's the way you sort of to experiment all the different channels, different plays, gather the data, and then once you sort of have conviction, then you go deep, and go full force on one.
Good analogy. We are in the middle of a round of funding, and we're having not a little bit of difficulty, but we are getting to know the VC world a little bit, and there's a huge amount of bad press at the moment. And obviously, with your background, David, you probably have insider experience on what's going on there. Like, what's your take on how VCs are evolving? All these extremely high valuation, and now not investing as much money as before, being very cautious about the investments.
Yeah, so I think the whole VC industry has really faced a reckoning over the last few years, from the dizzying highs of 2021 and the pandemic years, which were just booming, and there was unlimited money and valuations were just skyrocketing, to then the zero interest rate era ending, money getting more expensive, LPs actually starting to be a lot more cautious with how they invest. And that then trickles down to the VCs, who then have to tighten their belts and raise the bar for how they invest. Now, obviously, I think one of the things to remember about the VCs is like that they have their own bosses, which is the LPs. I think a lot of founders kind of get stuck in this idea that the VC is the kind of all-powerful God, who can kind of, write checks at will. But they have their own mandate that's determined by the LPs. And I know, like, during the start of the AI, like, hype cycle, if we want to call it, which, I think we're probably like kind of come down from a bit now. But there was a mandate for a lot of firms that they could only invest in AI, backed or AI native companies, even if they saw a great company that was, growing efficiently with an awesome team and blah, blah, blah. If it was in the wrong sector or the wrong industry, the LPs literally wouldn't let them invest in it, right? So there's then this like much smaller amount of capital available for everyone else. Now, also what happened is a bunch of VCs had to write down their investments, and they've had to quietly exit the market. No one is going to make a big song and dance when they shut down their fund and have to return money to investors. But you see some of the data coming out from Carter. I think it's like 30% of all VCs that were active, maybe even more than that, have actually folded, over the last couple of years. The amount of dry powder is a bit of a misnomer as well, because this is what LPs have, initially committed to, but they can, say to the VC, actually, I don't want you to deploy all this money, going to give back. And that dry powder isn't actually in the bank account of the VCs. And this is just a commitment. They do a capital call where the LPs will then give them a little bit of money. It's a trickle as they go, but they don't actually have all the money to invest anyway. So they have to, every time they kind of have to go and like ask for it, and they have to be justifying, that sort of ask. So the whole environment has really got squeezed, and that obviously then trickles down to the founders. So, as a founder, you're looking for capital. What's that going to mean? You're going to have a bunch more competition with companies who have historically been raising at much higher traction points. Series A companies who previously Series A benchmark was like 1 mil ARR, and you can go and raise a Series A, no worries. Now you're seeing seed companies with 1 mil ARR. And oftentimes you're seeing seed plus rounds from companies who should be raising a Series A, but they want to just like get a bit more of a top up, so then they can push out when they need to raise a Series A to when they have something closer to like 2, 3, 4 mil ARR. And that then means that all the actual seed stage firms who maybe only have a few $100,000 in ARR are competing against these, like Series A companies with a lot more traction. And obviously beyond just revenue, it's, as I mentioned before, there's different industries. AI kind of first companies kind of competing with the traditional B2B SaaS companies and everything else, and just being able to thread that needle as a founder has just got incredibly complex. Now, that's not to say there's all doom and gloom. I think the good news is that there's been a bunch of consolidation in the startup industry as well. You obviously see the number of startups that have shut down over the last 12 to 18 months. I think over the next 6 to 12 months, we'll probably see more of that. And then I think it'll stabilize where all the companies who raised these eye-watering rounds in 2020, 21, who couldn't grow into the valuation or for whatever reason had to do down rounds, get restructured and consolidated, that's all going to get washed out of the market. And then we're going to have this sort of new normal, probably by the end of this year, start of next year, from what I'm hearing, where we kind of can then, kind of carry forward with the new normal and the new expectations that everyone has. And I'm optimistic. I think, the Fed has already said that interest rates are going to start getting lowered. As that happens, money will start becoming more and more cheap again. There should be more appetite to these, larger sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, other sort of major LPs sort of push money back into the VC ecosystem. That kind of rising tide will lift all ships, and maybe the whole party will kind of start up again, in the years to come. But for where we are right now, that's the way I kind of see the landscape.
Yeah, great insight there. Great insight. I mean, if you had to systematically think of 3 or 4 things that VCs are putting at the top of their wish list when they're looking at who to invest in, what would you say that would be?
So the number one, this is almost like a qualifying factor, is can this generate outsized returns? Can this get to, call it, $1 billion in revenue at some point? Because the reality is the number of acquisitions over 100 million are very short and far between. So to IPO, you really need to have, revenues of hundreds of millions to kind of get to that huge kind of outsized return, which is going to pay back the whole fund, right? And that's the power law dynamics, the way the VC math is sort of, is modeled out. So that's just number one. Can this be a massive effing business? Doesn't have to be right now, but has got the potential where you can kind of see how it could expand. Number two is then what's the team that's building this, and do they have the credibility? Do we believe that they can do this? Are the founders, have they had previous experience in this space? Do they have certain insights or unique experience that would mean that they're the right people to build this? I think not just the founders, but the founding team that they sort of put together. The traction, obviously, people love data. VCs love data now more than ever. So can they dig into, either revenue, customers, product usage, any kind of things you can put together just with hard, cold numbers. And the bigger the company is, series A and onwards, it's almost more and more just about the numbers and about the data than about anything else. Seed and pre-seed, I think, is still more about the vision and the team and what this could potentially be. And then so the kind of market, the team, the traction, and then I think finally there's so many kind of different other factors you could put into this, but I would say that the product itself, and kind of, has it got differentiation? Is there defensibility? Is there a moat? And that's where I sort of see most investors sort of starting to sort of dig in more and more, which is okay, this is interesting, but now building a product is becoming easier and easier with the advent of these AI tools. Where is the proprietary data that you're generating? How can you defend against 1,000 copycat imitators that could spin up something that previously would have taken years and dozens of engineers? So sort of, kind of having a story and a narrative around that. And obviously, if you can weave, more kind of defensibility and differentiation into that, the better you're going to be. And that's where network effects and other things going to start kicking as well. If you haven't reviewed the NFX masterclass by James Currier and the NFX team, it's fantastic. And they've got 14, I think, different network effects that they kind of lay out. So if you can kind of dangle or hang your kind of product on one of those, I think you'll be in good stead.
Amazing. And what about the composition of the founding team? I hear a lot about specific attributes that are on the desirable list, should I say? What's your opinion on this? What should that look like?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different things that kind of go into it.
Yeah.
The like most astute investors, I should say, they kind of understand that where you went to college or where you previously worked aren't actually a really good predictor for being a successful founder. However, there are a lot of other investors who do think that is the case. Now, there's some certain things like that across the board that are like backed by data, which is you're more likely to be have a successful exit if you've had a successful exit before, right? And that's the whole thesis Ali Tama said at DCVC with the Super Founders book. So for founders had a successful exit, so that's a strong tick. Even if they didn't have a successful exit, if they've been a founder before, that also is a net positive, even if it failed or reached a sort of neutral position. And then from the actual like composition of the team, if that's what we're sort of talking about, whether they're having like technical and non-technical or sort of having different diversity on the team, I think generally as a blanket rule, having diversification of perspectives and experience is optimal. And these days, I think being a solo founder will hurt you, because the question is just going to be, you can't build this company by yourself. Who's going to build it with you? So you're going to have a strong narrative and story about that. But having a small team already in place who have had some success before, or at least have like kind of demonstrated the appetite for it, I think is going to take you a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk a little bit about, we spoke about how the VC landscape has changed over the last 5 years. And I think part of that is led into this notion of sustainable growth, right? So the growth of at all cost has kind of capitulated and is no longer a thing anymore. How are you seeing people prioritize this sustainable growth methodology instead going forward?
Yeah, it's a big question, right? Because this is just like the received wisdom from VCs telling their founders they've just invested in, especially like Series A and growth round, like this is the playbook. It's growth at all costs. Here's what you do.
Yeah.
You hire a bunch of people, bunch of SDRs, and we're going to equip them with all these tools. They're going to be phone, like mass power dialing, mass emailing, and just blanketing the entire market, spamming your TAM. Every quarter, we're going to touch every single target account. And then we're going to take the ones who are in market, I'm going to pass them along to the account executives who are only closing. They're not doing any of their own pipeline generation. They're just taking these leads from the SDRs and they're just closing them, pushing them through, doing what it takes. And then they hand it off to the customer success team. And then that's, they never see them again. So that model and that playbook, as you can see, is incredibly expensive because you're scaling up the number of humans and scaling up the number of touch points with your prospective buyers. And it's hugely inefficient because you're blanketing the entire market with all these touch points and all this human activity. And the actual like signal that you're getting from that blanketing that whole operation is actually really small. It's like a really, really, small percentage. So I think what people have come to realize is there's more efficient ways to get to that signal, which is who's actively buying, who's the best, fit target accounts for where we are right now for this product. And if you haven't already followed, I definitely recommend following Scott Martini's, who's one of the greatest kind of outbound architects and kind of talks a lot about how to just get to this one product, one narrow, ICP and one channel, and you can just start with that and then kind of layer on more and more as you go. And you don't have to blanket the entire market. You can just start with one really narrow segment of the market, get really close to them, really understand them deeply, serve them, solve that one workflow, and then you kind of move on to the next. Then you can expand out from there. Richard Purcell is also doing some amazing creative outbound go-to-market experiments and kind of running all these different plays to different signals, understanding the market, kind of designing the playbook of the future. So definitely also recommend following him. And the efficient growth model, I think, is arming humans with all the tools and the tech and allowing the heavy lifting almost to be done by all of the machines and all the, all the robots. And then the humans come in to build the relationships, to be those consultants, those creative problem solvers, and to actually be more kind of shoulder to shoulder with the buyer. It's less kind of adversarial across the table, trying to, convince them. It's more about educating. It's more about just sort of helping them understand, where your product fits into solving their pain. And it's less about trying to use kind of cheesy tactics of like optimizing subject lines and trying to trick people into meetings and things like that, which is just like, people can see that from a mile away, and people just get really turned off by it. I think like if you're trying to like spam like thousands of people as an early stage company, like you're actually doing brand damage. Like you should stop that and just like kind of focus in, spend the time to really get close to your ICP, talk to those customers, learn from them, play back what they say in your outbound and your marketing to other prospective buyers, and then kind of try and close them as happy customers, get referrals from them. And then obviously, I'd say, you should be doing almost no cold outbound until you get to 100 customers, to be honest. You should be really just fully leveraging the relationships that sit around your company. That's what we're trying to help founders to do is, think more broadly and kind of think bigger, that it's not just a network of the 2 or 3 co-founders and a couple of people you hired, but it's everyone in your cap table. It's all of your investors and everyone that works at the firm of your VC. It's not just that one VC who wrote the check. It's the 50, 100, 200 people who work at that company. They should all be added into your extended network. It's all of your customers' networks and everyone who works for your customers. It's all of your partners and all of your friends and your vendors, all of the different tools that you use. You should be leveraging all their networks. So it's really a lot broader than I think founders appreciate. It just takes a bit of time up front to do all that mapping. And that's kind of the first step. But then once you've mapped it, then that's an asset that's proprietary to you, to your firm, that you're going to then leverage again and again and again. And it's not just for sales, it's for fundraising. Right? It's the same thing. It's finding warm intros to investors. It's for recruiting. You're going to get some of the best talent coming from your network. And it's really like, where does the trust already exist that you can leverage rather than trying to build trust? Like it's a no-brainer when you kind of think about it. But it's not easy. And that's why, that's why we're having to try and educate people about the right way to do it, not necessarily the easy way.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Well, David, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. We are just about out of time, but you've dropped some amazing insight here, which I'm sure is going to be very valuable for our listeners. We do have a wrap-up question, however, which we do ask all of our guests, which is, through your whole career to date, what is your favorite memory and why?
Ooh.
There's the look. I don't know how many people watch the video versus just listening, but every time I ask the question, I always say, they look up to the skies.
I mean, one of the all-time, greatest, just like kind of, if I'm thinking about like full body chills kind of moment, is when I first went to the Sequoia office in Menlo Park, and I had that first meeting about them, potentially acquiring the startup, and
I wanted to talk about this story of the start of the acquisition as well.
Yeah, so I went in, like the lovely, like, sort of foyer, and they walked me through into the conference room, and up on the wall, is all of the logos, from the early days, from Airbnb and DoorDash and all the way back to Atari and Google. And, they had all of the logos up in this huge, like, 12-person boardroom. And, I met Jamie Bott, who was the talent partner at the time, and she was the most loveliest human. And, we started sort of talking and working together, and, very quickly it seemed like there was a great sort of culture fit, as well as, we're going to be able to sort of make the business acquisition happen as well. But that was probably the one of those kind of, skin tingling, just like crazy kind of moments where like you walk in, you see the big Sequoia logo, and then all of the logos up on the wall. And then ended up working there for a couple of years, which was great.
That's amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. This has been the Revenue Revolution podcast. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.